This is The Red Line, where we talk to three expert witnesses about one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. A few months ago, I was sitting in a bar in the capital of Moldova, talking with a few locals, exchanging views on the state of the world. After a few too many drinks in this cold, dimly lit bar, we started to discuss some of the leaders of the world, the good ones and the bad ones. It was later in the night my newly acquired friend Alex posed a question to the table. Who do we think was the most eccentric national leader in the world? Obviously the likes of Kim Jong-un of North Korea, Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, and Viktor Orban of Hungary all came up. But one leader stood above the rest. A leader who built gold statues of himself that rotate to face the sun. A leader that shoots targets while riding his bicycle. A leader that raps with his sons on live television. A leader whose predecessor changed the names of the months to things like his mother's name, his name, and his favorite childhood pet. The leader we all came to agreement on was Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, President of the Central Asian Republic of Turkmenistan, a nation of vast contradictions, a nation with the fourth largest gas reserves in the world, but with incredibly poor citizens. A nation surrounded by war zones, but does everything in its power to remain neutral. A nation with one of the largest airports in the region, but with almost no tourists. A nation that, much like its rotating gold statues, is turning away from where the sun was and towards where the sun will be. This week we look past the crazy stories we hear from the North Korea of Central Asia and look into the real, medium and long-term geopolitics of the nation of Turkmenistan. And to talk more about that, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Gas Giant.
Turkmenistan is one of the former 15 constituent republics of the Soviet Union. It's all the way down the what was then the south of the former Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union. Has a very long borders with Iran and Afghanistan, so it's got about 1,000 kilometers of border with Iran and another 800 with Afghanistan, and then up to the north it's got Uzbekistan above it, a very long border there, and then a tiny bit of border with Kazakhstan. So it's kind of tucked away in this little place. I'm sure anybody who's ever looked at Afghanistan on the map has seen Turkmenistan but not even noticed it was there.
Peter Leonard is a leading reporter on the Central Asian region and the editor of Eurasianet, one of the best sources for news on Central Asia and the Caucasus, and he joins us today.
A lot of desert, mostly desert, very dry. Got a bit of sea, inland sea, Caspian on the western side of the country. Pretty sparsely populated, dry, with some mountains on the south, but generally a pretty kind of hard scrabble sort of a terrain.
So during the Soviet era, Kazakhstan was very famous for its space program, and Ukraine was always a breadbasket for Russia. But what was Turkmenistan famous for?
To be honest, I think even today, or even people back in the Soviet times, if you'd asked them about Turkmenistan, I think even a lot of Soviet citizens would have had a lot of trouble finding the Turkmen SSR, as it would have been called then, on the map. So I don't think it was famous as such for anything. I think if anything, it was kind of famous for being pretty obscure. It's a place where you get gas. In truth, the country Turkmenistan, it was a sort of a Soviet concoction. There were many kind of tribal peoples living in this area, but there was never a country called Turkmenistan. So really, it was like many kind of territories in that part of the world, was more or less a sort of a Soviet invention. Really, not to say that there isn't such a thing as a Turkmen identity. That's certainly something that's sort of come into being in the last few decades, but. Its history is a recent one, I would say.
Turkmenistan is different in a lot of ways, really. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many of its republics like Ukraine and Armenia very quickly broke out into heavy fighting, but not Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan had a relatively peaceful transition out of the USSR, even keeping the same leader in place. Why was the transition so much easier for the Turkmens compared to some of its neighbors?
I think the one thing you have to take into consideration is all of the Central Asian republics, I think, were taken very much by surprise by the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think, if anything, they were very content with things as they were. And something that you find when you travel to Central Asia and speak to people who've lived through the 60s and 70s and 80s is that actually they consider often the latter part of the Soviet era actually a time of great prosperity and progress. I mean, if you go to especially rural areas, it was the 70s and maybe in some cases even later than that they first had things like telephones in their homes, or maybe in some places even electricity, right? And I just say that by way of explaining that the Soviet kind of legacy in Central Asia and Turkmenistan was obviously a mixed one, like it was for everywhere, but the latter part of the Soviet experience is perhaps seen not as negatively as it was in other parts. So in that sense, although there was a little kind of some rumblings of unrest, I wouldn't say you saw quite as much kind of this sort of striving for independence as you saw even in other parts of Central Asia, like Kazakhstan. I think, and then another important thing is that the dictatorship that eventually took hold in Turkmenistan took hold very quickly indeed, really. I mean, even before the Soviet Union had collapsed, when sort of some very sort of, let's say, primitive form of kind of democratic structures were coming into shape in the Soviet Union, even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, even by that time, figures like Sapar Murat Niyazov, the first president of Turkmenistan, had already been sort of enshrined as kind of de facto sort of potentate of that republic, and so that politically speaking, the transition was relatively smooth for people like that. And then when independence came along, there were kind of elections organized shortly after in which, he won with these kind of comical Saddam Hussein style kind of 99% of the vote.
And it really was a personality cult. He erected statues of himself throughout the country. He put his face on every government building, and a large amount of household items like vodka all had his face on them. He even renamed himself Turkmenbashi, which means the leader of the Turkmen. How did this sort of leader worship come along?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a breaking moment some point in the 90s in which, he went from being a sort of a run-of-the-mill sort of, petty dictator to suddenly transforming into something a little more exotic, let's say. I think it's very difficult and quite foolhardy to venture too much sort of armchair psychology with this sort of thing. But it is tempting, right? I mean, evidently he had this kind of megalomaniacal personality, although, before he was the kind of uncontested dictator of that country, it does not appear that he was an especially exceptional figure or charismatic. I mean, these people were put in charge of the republics back in the Soviet days, not because they were very strong and charismatic figures, but quite the contrary, because they were kind of malleable and just generally, didn't have too much of a mind of their own. So weirdly, I think sometimes in these cases, I think it's a little bit of insecurity almost. Sort of you kind of overcompensate by striving to make yourself the uncontested and absolutely, not just the uncontested leader, but almost as though you're kind of chosen by God, because that gives you a kind of, a legitimacy that can't be questioned when it seems almost like you're kind of the ordained kind of tyrant of this particular country.
So Turkmenbashi died quite suddenly in 2006, with the leadership passing over his son and instead going to a former dentist and now current president, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov. So why would Turkmenbashi leave the reins of Turkmenistan, the fourth largest gas reserves in the world, to a man with practically no real leadership experience?
He was by no means a healthy man. He was, by all accounts, a kind of sybaritic personality, a heavy drinker, and lived very unhealthily. But of course, when you are kind of an uncontested, dictator of your country, one thing that never happens is you never have people tell you to, maybe cut back on the cigars or, drink less or, live a bit healthily or maybe do more sit-ups or whatever. So, I'm sure he just kind of lived as widely as he felt suitable and then just suddenly dropped dead all of a sudden in 2006. And, I'm sure he must have imagined he had a long life ahead of him, and he didn't really give a great deal of thought to succession. The man who did eventually go on to be his president, there's no strong indication that he was picked out by Niyazov ahead of time. That seems to have been something that happened after Niyazov died. So in that sense, I would say, again, my very long answer could be, I think, summarized much more briefly in that he didn't pick a successor because he evidently never kind of considered the importance of it and never kind of, perhaps in his sort of extremes of delusion, never really properly sort of counted for the fact that he might one day not be around.
So here in the West, we may know Berdy Hermenedov from his outlandish acts, like riding bicycles while shooting targets, lifting a solid gold barbell above his head whilst ministers clap for minutes at a time, and singing rap songs with his grandsons on national TV. I mean, I understand why other leaders like Vladimir Putin do odd things like riding shirtless with a horse. I mean, it's to show that he's healthy and he'll be around for a long time, so feel free to invest long-term in Russia. But what does Berdy Hermenedov actually gain from doing these frankly quite peculiar acts?
So Niyazov dies all of a sudden, and we're not privy to exactly what went on behind the scenes, but it does seem as though there was a bit of a kind of elite stitch-up, and they put forward this guy who was a very unexceptional, very dull, kind of, a blink and miss him kind of figure. He was the former health minister. So they put this guy forward, and I think at the time when he first became president, I think it was pretty much, I think, quite a widely held view, maybe not consensus, that they sort of picked him because he was this sort of weak, malleable figure, and that maybe there were kind of elite insiders behind the scenes sort of pulling the strings. And, I've seen this guy up close, and I remember I went to Turkmenistan maybe a couple of years after he was elected president, and sure enough, he isn't this particularly impressive figure. But I'll tell you one thing that I remember really stayed with me, was that I was at this event. It was the opening of a hotel, and we had to stand out in the sun for about 3 hours because they always do these events before the president arrives. And I remember as he arrived, he pulls up outside. He steps outside his car and starts kind of walking up this row of all of these local people have all been kind of assembled to come and applaud for him. And people, as soon as he would walk past you, people would start applauding. But the moment he kind of went, 10 feet past, you'd stop applauding. Now, when you watch North Korean TV, the thing you notice is, I definitely get the sense of this is a kind of a level of adulation, which is, I'm not saying it's sincere, but it's, they really go for it. In Turkmenistan, I remember it really stayed with me that because I thought, people get it. They get that this guy's basically a bit of a buffoon. I mean, they might respect him on some level, but they can see, right, that this is not a form of dictatorship where people kind of totally absorbed that kind of, his authority. And yet, with time, as the years pass, he becomes more sort of confident. And so I don't know, I think we sometimes have it back to front with these sort of weird sort of dictators. I think what actually happens is that they can sometimes be these quite meek personalities, and by virtue of everyone telling them how great they are, and creating all this kind of facade of adulation around them, they suddenly start believing their own hype. And so after a number of years, 5 or 6 years, he suddenly becomes this much more sort of confident, swaggering figure. And then sure enough, he starts pulling all of these Putin-type stunts. And the one that comes to my mind was a time when he was opening a hospital, and he turned up and performed an operation. He removed a tumor from a patient's ear. He's a dentist. He has no training to be removing anyone's tumors. And other times he's ridden horses and driven cars and done all of these sorts of silly things. And the function is, I think, very similar to Putin, which is the idea is he's a man of action. He's capable, he's strong, he's virile, he's clever, he's all of these things, partly because those are all the things that a leader should be. Partly, I think, part of the thinking is with the previous president, he was this kind of fat, clearly very unhealthy lump. And I think that they kind of like the idea of projecting the new president as being dynamic and hands-on. And so I think that is a very important aspect of that sort of rather eccentric. It's not even a cult of personality. It's this kind of cult of a man of action.
So Turkmenistan has an immense amount of natural gas, with levels to almost rival giants like Qatar. However, the average Turkmen earns just 1/6 of what the average Qatari earns. Why is the average wage so different between these two gas giants?
Corruption. It's pretty brief answer, really. I mean, until as long as Niazov was alive, the gas that Turkmenistan sold, the revenues were handled in, God only knows how. Primarily, we suppose, sort of salted away in bank accounts in Europe. And when his successor came to power, when Berdi Muhamedov came to power, I think one of the first things that the government started to do was to kind of start rooting around these foreign bank accounts and try and kind of claw some of this money back. And, I think a lot of rather optimistic and naive people, and I include myself in those ranks, I think thought, well, maybe, the sort of revenues will be handled more responsibly or more transparently. But that does not appear to have happened. It's a country that's, has obviously no democratic accountability to speak of. The money gets spent not on improving people's welfare by and large, but on building, this kind of insane kind of Alice in Wonderland capital city, all built in gleaming marble, whilst, you go outside the capital and, as you've said, people, live in pretty abject conditions by and large. Public infrastructure is poor. I mean, it's, the short answer is the priorities are all wrong. I think for reasons best known to themselves, the national leadership of this country feels that projecting this sort of, Ottoman splendor is more important than raising the quality of life of its own people.
Turkmenistan, like many other resource states, tied itself very closely into its gas exports, with gas sales now making up over 70% of the country's GDP. But now with Moscow and Riyadh's oil price war, the price of gas is plummeting. Because of this, the Turkmen economy is nosediving, and we're seeing the first large-scale protests in the country since the end of the Soviet Union. But what do you think this means for Turkmenistan?
There are some people who anticipate kind of an imminent sort of dissolving of the country that will kind of fall apart under the weight of bad government and intensifying poverty. I'm a little bit more sanguine about it in the sense that I think that, yes, you will see things like what you're alluding to, large groups of angry villagers coming out and blocking roads and kind of, grabbing local officials by the lapels and, and demanding explanations. I think that that's likely to happen, and that's always happens when resources are short. I'm very skeptical about it actually escalating into a kind of a threat to the system, because there's, goes without saying, I think by this point, that there's nothing resembling a political opposition inside the country. In fact, there's not even much of an opposition outside the country, truth be told, because the exiled opponents are all kind of squabble among themselves and have kind of absolutely zero visibility, and have not been very skillful in kind of nurturing any kind of authority for themselves among the kind of expatriate Turkmen population. So I think that what you're likely to see, if the economy does indeed take more of a nosedive than it's doing at the moment, you're going to see a lot more of these kind of isolated incidents. My opinion is, though, that it will not translate into an actual threat to the system. This sort of the moral of experiences like Ukraine, for example, have definitely been absorbed by many countries in the former Soviet Union in a way that makes them kind of very wary and cautious about, kind of. It'll take a lot before they come out protesting, because I think that they very much link protesting to the potential of kind of collapse and sort of political chaos. There's always a little bit of very sort of subtle signaling, I think, even in state news about the risks of kind of raising your head and causing trouble. I mean, the implication is always do it, and the collapse of the country will duly follow.
Turkmenistan is a real oddity in the region alliance-wise as well, famously being as neutral as possible. It's not a part of the Moscow-led CIS or the Beijing-led Shanghai Cooperation Group. It even has a huge monument to neutrality in the capital Ashgabat. Why is Turkmenistan so set on being a neutral country?
I think it's very easy to sort of mock them for that sort of thing, and it makes them seem even more kind of like the kid in the corner and these sort of weird loners. But I think in fairness to them, again, just to go back to what I was saying in the beginning, look at where they are on the map. They're two neighbors with the longest borders. Maybe not the longest borders, but with the very long borders, Iran and Afghanistan. I mean, this is in 1991 when Turkmenistan became an independent country. You had Afghanistan, which already was, well into decades of this kind of civil war, whatever you want to call what was happening in Afghanistan at the time. Iran down below, and then above them they had these other kind of former fellow constituent members of the Soviet Union, ostensibly quite sort of friendly nations, and yet frenemies, I think is probably the best way to describe them. Like they're kind of friendly, but a lot of these Central Asian countries had these sort of weird kind of tensions and rivalries as well. And so I think they must have sort of, the day that independence was thrust upon them, because it was thrust upon them, the president must have just looked around and said, okay, what do we do, right? Do we throw in our lot with Iran? Well, that's not an option. Do we throw in our lot with the other Central Asian guys who we don't really like? That's not an option either. Do we throw in our lot with Russia? Well, no, they're the former kind of overlords. Do we throw in our lot with the West, all the way over there? The West might as well be on the moon for all it mattered. They could throw in their lot a little bit with Turkey, but Turkey at that time was not some sort of economic powerhouse by a long shot. So I think that they simply thought that, from taking a very pragmatic perspective, that if you are neutral, you're not anybody's friend as such, but you're not anybody's enemy either. And that's the basic principle of Turkmen diplomacy. Nobody's threatening Turkmenistan. Nobody's sanctioning Turkmenistan. All they want to do with Turkmenistan, despite the fact it's one of the world's worst dictatorship, is basically buy their gas and leave them the hell alone.
When we did our recent North Korea piece, we came across many of these same underlying factors that are present in both Turkmenistan and North Korea. What we did find difficult, though, was getting news from someone on the ground, someone who'd grown up there, someone who can paint a picture of what it's like living in this desert of contradictions. Well, luckily for this episode, we turned to a journalist from Turkmenistan, someone who grew up inside the system, someone who can give us an inside look into the marble palaces and sprawling gas fields of Ashgabat, the capital of Turkmenistan. So for all that, we turn to our next guest.
Part 2. off the radar.
Ashgabat, it's mostly covered by desert. It looks like something like in between Dubai and North Korea.
Nazar grew up in Turkmenistan and is the former director of the Turkmen Service for Radio Free Europe and has published numerous articles on Turkmenistan for publications like the Washington Post. It is amazing to have Naz on the show, chatting in English, her fifth language. She joins us today.
It did not change much since the Soviet times in terms of development, and critics say it even got worse because it's one of the most closed countries in the world. It's highly secretive. The statistics are highly unreliable. Independent information is suppressed, and so it's very strictly from top to down controlled country, ruled by President Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov. There are rumors that he wants his son to succeed him, and after that it would be probably his grandson.
So I want to talk about the founder of the country, Niyazov, better known as Turkmenbashi. How was he viewed in Turkmenistan?
Niyazov came to power during the Soviet era. He was the head of the Communist Party of Turkmenistan, so he was appointed by Moscow to power. Official Turkmen media about him that he was seen as he was projected as a god king. He's our leader. Like there is no other way for another leader than him. It was like the propaganda was like the world would the Turkmenistan would end when Niyazov would die. So something like that. He was seen very much as portrayed as god king. Criticism of him was impossible. He was like King Jong-un in North Korea.
So I want to talk about the Rukhnama, a usually purple and green little book of poems written by Turkmenbashi himself. This book was everywhere. When you go for your driving test, the test would be on parts of the Rukhnama and how well you memorized it. Even school exams were mostly based on the Rukhnama. Mosques were also instructed to teach the Rukhnama alongside the Quran. But what I want to know is, how was this book viewed by Turkmen citizens?
Rukhnama was a compulsory education subject in the schools. Everyone should read it, not only in the schools but also even factory workers and hospital personnel. They should all be able to remember the sections from the Rukhnama, and in official ceremonies they should read from Rukhnama and things like that. And it was said that it became like a sort of Turkmen's second Quran, you know.
So let's bring it forward to today and talk about some of Ashgabat's friends. Turkey is home to the largest amount of Turkmens outside of Turkmenistan, and the two countries have great relations. So why is Turkey and Turkmenistan so close?
It dates back to the Niyazov era after Turkmenistan became independent. Among the first companies that made contacts in Turkmenistan were the Turks. The Turkish companies, they were involved in construction in Ashgabat, and they built a lot of hotels, government buildings, and statues, the like. There was, although Turkmenistan is risky for investment and for trade, a lot of small level or middle level companies from Turkey saw a chance for engaging with Turkmenistan and went there, and a lot of young Turkmen people not able to find jobs in Turkmenistan. The official unemployment rate is around 5%, but the unofficial is like goes up to 50%. So lots of young Turks went to Turkey to seek jobs and then sent some money home. There is also, of course, it should be mentioned, cultural bonds with Turkey because of the Turkmen people are speak Turkic language, and there were it were the Turkmens who went to Minor Asia in this 12th century and conquered parts of Anatolia, the Minor Asia. And so there is a historic bond, there is a cultural bond, ethnic bonds with Turkey. So that's why Turkey was one of the first destinations for desperate Turkmen people to find jobs.
What I want to understand is Turkmenistan still has voting, with the president winning around 95% of the vote each time. So how does voting and campaigning work in a country like Turkmenistan?
First of all, they are not real competing candidates. They're all, when voting takes place, they are all from Berdimuhamedov's party, the candidates. And they're being voted, and this says the official data says 99% of the voters took place, and Berdimuhamedov won the last elections, winning almost 90% of the vote. And so this is like how to say confirmation, not really voting, a confirmation. You confirm someone, the government wants to be elected, and the people have confirmed, and that's it, what we have waited from them, and the job is done. That's like election in Turkmenistan. There's no real and free election with opposing candidates. No opposition parties are there, and the parliament approves each and every decision by Berdimuhamedov, and the laws are passed with 100% of the voting, and that's it. Well, that's the voting in Turkmenistan.
So this week we've seen large-scale protests in Turkmenabad, the largest since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do you think these protests will develop into something bigger, or they're just a one-off spike?
There are scattered protests of a few people. According to independent sources, the government never reports about protests. So what we know about this so far from a few sources is that a few people are protesting about bread and flour shortage, in general food shortage that affects these regions, the periphery. Ashgabat, I heard, is better equipped with food because there is the government is in the capital, and it's pretty much in a better situation than the periphery. But in the provinces, there is scarcity of food, and people are suffering from this, and people selling their personal belongings on the market to make income, and a lot of people fled abroad to look for jobs. So there is a widespread poverty in the country, and there are now people who are not ready to keep silent on this. That's not going to change for the foreseeable future, I think. Under Berdimuhamedov, it certainly won't change.
How did a nation with so much gas fly right under the radar? Being right next to some of the world's geopolitical hotspots like Afghanistan, Iran, Russia, and Azerbaijan, you would assume there'd be a far brighter spotlight on this Central Asian gas giant. Even the government can't decide whether it wants to turn inwards or face the outside world. Like spending billions of dollars on an airport the size of Tel Aviv, but making it so difficult to acquire tourist visas that they see less than 10,000 people a year due to a closed-off Soviet mentality. For comparison, its direct neighbor Uzbekistan sees 6.8 million tourists a year, but Turkmenistan sees less than 10,000. This is a country who, like many others, put all their eggs in one basket and rode the wave of the gas price to the top, but is now feeling the pinch when it all came crashing down. The Turkmen now owe huge sums of money to China. Tensions are escalating with Iran, and Moscow is heaping pressure upon them in the Caspian. The small, dark corner Ashgabat has been hiding in for decades is quickly shrinking. And to talk more about that, we turn to our next guest.
Part 3. All roads lead east.
So Turkmenistan remains one of the most intriguing and enigmatic states, not only in Central Asia, but in the entire world. It's been ruled by two presidents, both quite quirky personalities who have refashioned the state, its bureaucracy, domestic politics, foreign policy, into their own image and to prioritize their own domestic, political, and personal needs.
Alexander Cooley is the director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. He's also a professor of political science at Barnard College and the author of some of the best books on Central Asia, including the hugely popular Dictators Without Borders. And it's great to have Alex back on the show.
Turkmenistan has been a very top-down country that has modeled itself, I would say, relatively unsuccessfully on a Gulf-style hydrocarbon producer that takes revenues from the export, in this case, of natural gas, and feeds them into the population in the form of subsidized food, energy, housing, and that creates the basis of the social bargain, right? People have basic needs. The state is quite big, but that means the political system is closed, that all dissent is squashed, that there is a real paranoia about any kind of political opposition, independent media. There's real concern about exile groups that live abroad in both Europe and in Turkey. And the system has been relatively stable in that you've seen, a relatively smooth succession, and you've seen both of these rulers, in power for over a decade. But the system requires revenue, and I think that's one of the interesting fallouts of COVID, with a drop in demand in gas from natural, for China. Whether Turkmenistan is obtaining the same revenues.
So after the transition to republics, regional neighbors like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan began to open their doors to the international community. But Turkmenistan never did. Why would they remain so closed in?
It made the decision very early on to function in a very managed manner and not to open up. And part of that is a bit of Soviet legacy. Part of it is a small population, and with a population of about 6 million people, a perception from early on that they didn't have to open up, that they could just be distributive. Nyasov very fancifully used to sort of tout that many outsiders were looking at his substantial reserves of natural gas and referring to Turkmenistan as natural gas Kuwait. And of course, that now seems, now seems silly. But behind that was the reasoning that if we just pump gas out, then we don't actually have to open up politically, economically. Everyone can have basic needs taken care of. And then the state can pursue in its foreign relations this kind of touted policy of neutrality.
So compared to its neighbors, Turkmenistan is very internationally isolated. It's not part of the Moscow-led CIS or the Beijing-led Shanghai Cooperation Group. So why would it avoid joining these huge multinational organizations like all its other neighbors have?
So Nyasov from the very beginning coined this idea of Turkmen neutrality, and he did it in a few ways, right? One was a kind of, refusal to adhere to international norms, And, from very early on, he pushed back against, Western criticism of things like human rights practices and governance practices. He never admitted, for example, the OSCE election monitors, right? That everyone else was admitting, even Russia, right? Even, his neighbors in the 1990s. So he did not like that kind of external interference or monitoring of his affairs. That was on the one hand. On the other hand, in part to justify that, and in order, again, to preserve, his autonomy, he made a point, as you said, of not joining the CIS, not joining the SCO, even though effectively Turkmenistan sends observers and delegates to a lot of these meetings, so as to sort of underscore that point. Now, what's interesting about it is that Turkmenistan, you would think being able to do that was a function of a lack of dependence on Russia. And that wasn't true. In the 1990s, Turkmenistan was wholly dependent on this old Soviet era pipeline network, the central piping network, in which Turkmen gas would go along the grid and be piped effectively westward. And through the 2000s, that it would act as a supplier via some very shady intermediary trading companies to Europe via Ukraine, and ultimately feeding the the Gazprom network. But so that wasn't really the answer. But Moscow seemed okay with these kinds of status and sort of symbolic plays of maintaining this neutrality. What became a little thornier for Turkmenistan was in the 2000s, and especially post 9/11, when the U.S. emerged in the region, and there was, for a while, a rumored American presence in Turkmenistan that that was logistically supporting the global war on terror. A lot of Central Asian diplomats and officials would sort of talk about the old Soviet air base at Marie being used for different coalition-led missions into Afghanistan. That was never confirmed on the U.S. side.
So let's talk about some of its neighbors. What is the current relationship like between Ashgabat and Tehran?
It's a relationship that has gone through. It's been pretty icy for most of the time, and has gone through different periods of being, functional, never really warm. That we never saw the kind of, say, economic integration at the border that you might expect. The main linchpin of the relationship has been a kind of a natural gas swap agreement. And, by background of this, I should say Turkmenistan, because it was so reliant on the Soviet era network that was dominated by Gazprom and Russia, its number one foreign policy objective was always to find alternative routes out for its gas. And the first deal it signed was with Iran. It was a 10 BCM swap deal through which Turkmen gas would go to northern part of Iran, and then Iran would export gas that it had produced domestically elsewhere on behalf of Turkmenistan. But you never got the kind of extensive economic ties, cultural ties, people-to-people ties. So the Iranian relationship is okay. But it is subject to also complaints about shirking and cheating on the arrangement.
So let's move from the Turkmen southern border to its western borders on the Caspian Sea. There has been huge tensions escalating with Russia in these waters. So why is Moscow and Ashgabat fighting over the Caspian Sea?
Yeah, this all goes back to having autonomy, autonomy of action to ensure, control over, the resources that are delineated out within the Caspian, especially the offshore resources. I think, important thing to remember about the Turkmens in terms of, their kind of energy outlook is they even have refused to do any production sharing agreements with, external investors, save, the important exception of CNPC, which they set up one important one during the financial crisis.
After Turkmenistan turned its back on Gazprom and the Russian pipelines heading west, they worked on pipelines heading east. The first and much larger of the pipelines goes through Uzbekistan, into Kazakhstan, and then into western China, where it supplies about 30% of China's total gas. The other one, known as the Tapi pipeline, goes from western Turkmenistan into Afghanistan, through Pakistan, and into India, supplying gas to each of these countries along the way through. So which pipeline do you think is more important to Ashgabat?
Well, without a doubt, the most important pipeline, and really I would say the most important pipeline in the region is the Central Asia China pipeline that originated in Turkmenistan. And what's really fascinating about this is that, throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, policy analysts were viewing the key to sort of Turkmenistan's potentially, energy autonomy as being rooted in the West, right? And so there were sort of talks about potential new Trans-Caspian pipeline that would be built. There was, lobbying campaigns, especially in the West and Western think tanks, to ensure that such a pipeline would bypass Russia and would, be sort of an equivalent to the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline that was sort of constructed in the 1990s. But then all of a sudden in 2006, after scoping out the place, the Chinese announced that they would begin a construction on a pipeline in CNPC that would take Turkmen gas from these fields in the east of the country and route them through this network in Uzbekistan, in Kazakhstan, and have it join the Chinese natural gas pipeline out in its west. And what's remarkable about this was that this was built in 3 years' time. In 2009, it was done. It was inaugurated. That initially a line A, a line B were built, then a line C, different sort of spurs feeding it from Kazakhstan and so forth. And now a line D, on and off, on again, that will route around and also include Kyrgyzstan as a transit country to access some Tajik fields. What you have is effectively Turkmenistan as the main node of an entire gas export and regional distribution system, right? Because you're getting gasification of certain Kazakh cities too along this. So after all this back and forth about creating Western options for Turkmenistan, and Central Asia, the Chinese came in and very quickly just created these, very new facts on the ground with China, Central Asia. And, back in April 2009, in the wake of, the great financial crisis there and reduced natural gas demand in Europe, the Russians sort of turned off the taps on the Turkmens, and essentially, there's some speculation as to what exactly happened, but part of the pipeline blew up either for a technical reason because it wasn't utilized. But at that point, Turkmenistan made the wholesale switch from being completely dependent on Russia to being then dependent on this new network that came online that year. And it really hasn't looked back since. It's been piping this gas. They did over 30 billion cubic meters last year. Most of its export revenue now is a function of that. I'll say one more thing about that, and then I'll address Tapi. In 2008, when things were really bad last time we had a financial crisis, the Turkmens did a deal with CNPC that allowed the company a PSA into the east, but also kind of staged a couple of $4 billion emergency loans that would be repaid over a couple of decades with these sort of natural gas exports. And so essentially, China would say, it just made a good investment, one of these energy barter deals, as it had in other parts of the world, made a sort of similar thing with, the Kazakhs and in Ecuador and, Brazil and also with Russia. But the fact of what Beijing did was keep the Turkmen economy afloat, became effectively a lender of last resort by giving this advanced sort of prepayment, this investment. And so that enabled Ashgabat to stay on its feet. It didn't have to turn, it couldn't turn to the IMF because it wasn't a member in good standing. It was supposedly at the time looking into negotiating some private loans from Western and German banks. But it didn't have to do that. And so China not only became an investor, it became a kind of a regional hegemonic patron, right? Coming to keep it afloat. So the Chinese relationship means a lot in a lot of different contexts, and the pipeline's at the center of that. TAPI, in some ways, has been the kind of new geopolitical unicorn that's been pushed, especially by the West, to try and give Turkmenistan that other vector, that other option. I think for the Turkmens, ideally, TAPI would not only bring about a different source of revenue in terms of, sort of gas reaching, different kinds of customers and different markets, and creating this sort of southern vector, but would also potentially give it some leverage over Beijing, over pricing, over terms. We don't know a lot about the nature of these contracts, but by everything that comes out and reported, they're really favorable to Beijing. So that was the plan anyway. And of course, the constituencies that wanted to develop Afghanistan and see it become more integrated, enhance its connectivity was the buzzword. We're also pushing this, and so you had American advisors, at the center of sort of TAPI, pushing the project. But the pipeline is still delayed. There are a lot of technical legal issues, but I think the bottom line in understanding Turkmenistan's attitude towards TAPI is that it just wants to sell its gas at the border, and it wants everyone else to take care of the details, right? In terms of sort of transit, transportation, legal fees, and these kinds of things. So, potentially in a world of sort of functioning states and a cooperative region, TAPI could become, an important option in Ashgabat's sort of foreign policy, both energy and broader foreign policy profile. But at the moment, it's China, 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 and the Central Asia China pipeline is really the main, I would say, lifeline of the country.
So as Turkmenistan turns towards China, what is the relationship like between Turkmenistan and their old masters in Moscow?
It's been strained, as with other countries, as the other neighbors we've talked about. We know that, Berdy Muhamedov was incensed at, the kind of, the hardball closing tactics that the Russians exercised in 2000, in the 2000s. I would say it's a little more complex than that. I think, the Turkmens have always behind the scenes consulted with the Russians. They've always kept them abreast of sort of security developments. They've tried to reassure them when it comes to dealings both with the West of the United States and the Chinese. The Russians used to man the border with Afghanistan, right? Used to have sort of a Russian border guard that was, as in Tajikistan, that was sort of phased out, and they were replaced with Turkmens. Now there have been reports of more cooperation with Russian troops and Russian advisors, and especially concerns about the potential for, militant spillover on the Turkmen border. Instability in bordering regions in Afghanistan is something that is of, great concern to authorities, and of course, dealings with ISIS, even the chasing of certain ISIS factions into Turkmen territory and then back. Recognizing that Russia is the security guarantor, there have been talks and some informal kinds of arrangements there. But at the end of the day, Turkmenistan's not that central to Russia. Beyond Russia's own sort of self-perception as the regional hegemon and security guarantor, and given the fact that Russia's the profile of Russia's own gas business has changed over the last 10 years too. Turkmenistan isn't this kind of critical kind of top-off supplier that would mop up some of the excess demand from Europe that you saw sort of in the 2000s. Of course, many in the bureaucracy still speak Russian. There's still a lot of respect for Russia, a lot of sort of accommodation of its views. And I think sort of, honestly, post-2014, Russian actions in Crimea also sent some alarm bells ringing in Ashgabat too, and they wanted to ensure relatively stable and productive relations. I wouldn't say Turkmenistan is as much of a political client to Russia, say, as Kyrgyzstan is, right? We could say Kyrgyzstan is really dependent on Russia in a lot of different ways. You don't have the same kind of vector of migration, right, in Russia that you do from countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and even Uzbekistan. But I think there's widespread recognition that Russia will continue to be an important player.
So where do you see Turkmenistan going in the next 10 to 15 years?
Well, I think, at some point, we're going to see, some other type of regime transition. I don't think that there's a lot of appetite, to overthrow Berdimuhamedov. I think, there is a kind of a sense of, all the bureaucrats are, in this together and want to keep the ship sort of afloat and going. I think the real kind of challenge is whether they take some actual steps to integrate more with the world, right? Or how long can they keep this, this kind of very selective, outward-facing set of deals with the world. So, my own view on this is that you're not going to have any kind of radical change. I think that even if you were to have some sort of regime transition, it would be a relatively sort of similar kind of playbook with more of an outward, stylistically, more kind of friendly face, the way Berdimuhamedov himself was sort of initially in 2007, 2008. He was getting a lot of goodwill and potential engagement. But I don't think that, the fundamental geopolitical orientation of Turkmenistan is going to change. Now, some of the wild cards that might change that are the following. If you have some sort of economic shock or collapse in China, right, that really ruptures that trading relationship, I think that would become a real disruptor in Turkmenistan, maybe catastrophically so. I think a regime change in Iran would have some interesting implications. I think, the Turkmens would be really concerned about that, but perhaps that could offer, the possibility of, a sort of a much more kind of robust set of economic relationships, and especially sort of the sanctions regime were to be lifted. And then, of course, what happens in Afghanistan is going to be of real concern too. So I think looking forward, over sort of 10 years' time, there's a lot of reasons to be paranoid in Turkmenistan, and there's not a lot of reasons to be optimistic in Turkmenistan. And unfortunately, I think they're in a tough neighborhood with neighbors that have real complications. And rather than proactively help shape these events and deal with them, I think the incentive structure, especially given their own domestic, economic, and increasing social problems, is to just wall themselves off and try to hermetically seal themselves from these regional goings-on.
My last question for you. Is the future of Turkmenistan towards Beijing, towards Washington, or towards Moscow?
I think without a doubt the future goes to Beijing, the present goes to Beijing. I think this is a relationship that really supplanted Moscow overnight. And, it's also extremely important for the Chinese in the sense that, they have locked Turkmenistan into long-term contracts and relationships, a very high percentage. I don't know exactly what it is. I think sometimes it's even sort of 60 of 70s, or the Turkmen, or rather overseas piped gas comes from effectively, the Turkmen pipeline. Chinese also get gas from Myanmar and some other places. But, if you look year on year, and this is something that shocks a lot of observers, you'll see Turkmenistan is easily in the top 5 of countries that are most dependent on China economically. And you say, well, how can that be? Turkmenistan doesn't have a border with China. It's not a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But again, it lets you know how central this gas dimension is. So yes, the patron now is Beijing. The public goods provider is essentially Beijing. The lender of last resort is Beijing. And, I think this crisis poses, I think, a real, a really interesting question, especially to authorities in China too. Are they going to be willing to extend another helping hand to Ashgabat? Are they going to be willing to restructure some terms, maybe give them another loan? What will they demand in return? I think there's a sense that, the levers that they have over Ashgabat make Ashgabat actually particularly vulnerable, I think, to sort of Chinese demands now, especially in this climate, and especially given the fear that China is going or has requested a reduction in overall piping volume from the network because of the economic sort of slowdown. So I think beyond that, I think what the Turkmens would like to see is a set of balanced relationships, not excluding Moscow. Moscow would be part of it. The Gulf especially would be part of it. I think there's real appetite for investment from the UAE. There would, I think, be, partnerships with, India and Pakistan, obviously through TAPI, but also some of the other, Asian countries, Japan, South Korea, keep the kind of construction contracts and relationships with with Turkey going, and some of the economic links, there would be kind of multiple patrons. But at the end of the day, when you're dependent on one export, it's that country that calls the shots. And my sense is that Ashgabat is locked into a dependency and, frankly, a client status to Beijing for the foreseeable future.
Turkmenistan is in a rough neighborhood. If Afghanistan boils over, many of the fighters will pour over the border into Turkmenistan, a country already very fragile. Relations with Iran must be trodden lightly, as the Turkmen capital is only 10 kilometers from the Iranian border, and the Iranians certainly have the armed forces to cripple the Turkmens if they want to. Russia wants all of the gas trade with Europe to itself, to continue its monopoly and its hold on Central and Southern Europe. So Moscow works to block the Caspian and forever prevent a pipeline that will allow the Turkmens to sell Europe the gas it so desperately needs, and finally bring competition to the Russian gas market. And with the way the Turkmen army is at the moment, the way west is likely blocked forever. So east it turns, towards Beijing and New Delhi. The trouble with New Delhi, though, is that building a pipeline there relies on a stable pipeline through war-torn Afghanistan and some of the most unstable parts of Pakistan, all of which are likely to sabotage or steal parts of the gas for themselves. But what choice do they have? For Turkmenistan to sell everything to just one client, China, it means that China sets the prices, China sets the demand, and China dictates the future of Turkmenistan. The Turkmen have tried for decades to take orders from no one, but now they take orders from just one: Beijing. Thank you so much for listening to the show. We had a record listenership last month, and once again, it was thanks to you guys liking and sharing all of our stuff. From the team here at the Red Line, thank you again. If you want to support the show, you can visit our Patreon. Our Patreons get transcripts of the show, book recommendations, live Q&As with myself and the guests, as well as the ability to suggest topics for the show. We try to give back as much as we can to our amazing Patreons, and they're the reason this show keeps going. You can support the show on social media by liking us. We're available on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and all the other platforms under @TheRedLinePod. And you can follow me on Twitter personally @MikeHilliottOz, Oz for Australia. Another big thanks goes out to this week's guests. Leonard and Eurasianet have always been one of my main sources of news for this region of the world. Peter, being the editor, has his finger right on the pulse, and it was great to get him on the program. You can find Peter on Twitter @Peter_Leonard, or follow Eurasianet on @Eurasianet. Naz gave an amazing insight into what it's like being from Turkmenistan, and she's been great to have on the show. English is her 5th language, and she not only nailed the interview, but also gave a great Turkmen perspective that not a lot of people get to hear. You can follow her work for Radio Free Europe at RFERL on Twitter. Alex Cooley came on the show in January for our piece on Kyrgyzstan, and I highly recommend you check that out as well. And it was amazing to have him on again. His book, Dictators Without Borders, was easily one of my favorite books from 3 years ago. It was the main reason I booked a trip to go research from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. His new book, Exit from Hegemony, is out now, and if it's anything near as good as the last one he released, it will be near the top of my reading list again. You can follow Alex on Twitter @Cooley on Eurasia, and we hope to have him back on the show for a 3rd time soon. Once again, a thank you goes out to Mark Spencer for providing the additional vocals for the piece. We couldn't do it without Mark. Another thanks goes out to Nick Munch for helping write, prepare, and research the stories. Nick has become a fantastic asset to the team, and we're very lucky to have him. We also had Joseph Hawthorne join the team this week to help with some of the editing. We look forward to working more with Joe, and we're thrilled to have him aboard. Once again, a thank you to you for listening to the program. It really does mean the absolute world to me to see all the listens, the Twitter DMs I get, and the feedback we see from the show. We'll be back with another episode in just a fortnight's time. But until then, thank you and good night.